So I want to talk about Dodge truck rear suspensions. 1961, from the early 1960s until the 1980s, because they're all pretty much the same. And the reason why I want to talk about that is because on our Street Freak Gasser project here, we've got a Dodge truck rear suspension under it, and I've got to try to make this thing work. And if you've ever dealt with the rear suspension, if you ever hot rodded, a D150, and actually tried to get the thing to bite and go, you know exactly what I'm talking about now. The axle hop, the craziness that happens when you come off the clutch or you hit it hard. I'm going to show you why it happens, and we'll talk about some possible solutions. But before we do that, we have to go back to a video we did about a month or two ago. We talked about how good the Chrysler rear suspension was in a classic era Mopars, and how it was ideally suited to acceleration, to drag racing. I'll show you on this GTX just for a quick refresher. So Chrysler cars of the era had what's called an asymmetrical leaf spring, meaning that the front section of the spring is shorter than the rear section of the spring. The axle housing is approximately 1/3 the distance instead of being halfway. General Motors and Ford car leaf spring suspensions have a symmetrical setup where where the axle is centered in the spring, and what that does is that causes wheel hop. That causes the front segment of the spring, the long front segment of the spring, to want to waffle. So as torque is applied, the main leaf will want to go like this, and then it's a spring, so obviously once it goes like this, it's going to want to go back like that with an equal amount of force, and that's where wheel hop comes from. And that's why you use traction bars and slapper bars and everything on that type of rear. On the car, the A body, B body, the traditional classic era Mopar suspension, you've got the asymmetrical spring. The axle is mounted, as in just about every car application, above the spring, and it's mounted directly to the main leaf. So the rotational force has the least amount of leverage to try and distort that spring. This setup is ideal. And then on top of that, you have a limiter called a pinion snubber, which is mounted at the snout of the rear end center section, and it contacts the floor when the rear end is under extreme use. So, which also helps to plant the suspension, because every action has an opposite reaction. So as the pinion snubber is pushing up on the floor, it's pushing down on the tire. Okay, so this is about the most ideal suspension setup for acceleration there is. When you get to the Dodge truck, it's the exact opposite in every way. So I'll show you what we're contending with over here. This rear suspension is a 1970 Dodge D100. And it's essentially the same as all of your light-duty pickups from the early 1960s until the 1980s. In essence, this is what you're going to be coming across. There are slight differences in the number of leaves and the stagger of leaves, but for the most part, the configuration is the same, and this is universal. So if you remember on the car suspension, you have an asymmetrical spring. On the truck, it's symmetrical. So the axle is mounted exactly in the center of the spring. Where on the car, the axle is mounted on top of the spring directly to the main leaf. On the truck, the axle is mounted at the bottom of the pack underneath it all. So you've got the leverage, the extra leverage from the axle center line to the main leaf, which is an extra like 5 inches, that's able to exert twisting force on the rear. So the further away this is from the main leaf, the more leverage it's going to have to twist things. On a truck, there is no pinion snubber. In fact, there's no place to mount a pinion snubber on a truck. Because the truck is supposed to have a longer let's say, travel suspension. So you couldn't put a pinion snubber on there. You'd be pushing down on the front of the rear end every time you loaded up the deck or you hooked up a heavy trailer to it. So they didn't use any sort of pinion snubber on the truck at all. Instead, what Dodge did was they added this bottom leaf. This is universal to all of these trucks. And this bottom leaf, the straight one, is a limiter. It takes the place of the pinion snubber during normal use. So in other words, just backing up hard or going forward hard. This spring, the rear end will twist. This spring comes in contact with the rest of the pack and limits it. But now let's just say you've hot rodded this thing and you got 400 horsepower and you got sticky tires and you're going to make it go. Well, when this contacts the section of the spring that it does, it's pushing up right at the weakest point of the main leaf, the top main leaf. So it would actually aggravate an axle wrap situation. So you've got that every action has a positive reaction. Well, this thing slams into the pack, bends it all up, and it's going to want to go back down again. Crazy axle hop. You've also got another situation with, now there's a difference in spring packs. These things are all universal that I'm showing you, but there's a difference in spring packs. And this one is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Now remember, the Chryslers, when they design the suspension, they're concerned with payload, and they're concerned with, you're going to hook a trailer to this thing with a heavy tongue weight. So they're more concerned with the spring's ability to balance weight than they are with its ability to move the thing forward and backwards. So on this spring pack here, you'll see that the second spring, the second leaf, comes all the way to the rear spring eye. Okay? But if you go to the front, where we need it for acceleration, it ends a good 7 or 8 inches away from the front spring eye. Now this would be actually an easy fix. All you would have to do is take this pack apart, take this spring, and flip it around the other way. And then the long segment would be here, and it would be bolstering. Actually, it would be a very effective fix. It would help to bolster this main leaf. Now another thing we do with the car suspension is that we will unclamp the rear springs, the rear segments of the leaves. And that's because as the car is accelerating and the pinion is heading up, it allows these springs to separate and focus more force on the front spring eye to help plant the car. If you do it on this, you're having the exact opposite effect. When these things fan out, they're actually pushing up on the main leaf, the long segment of the main leaf that has a tendency to want to rise anyway. So on a truck, you want to actually clamp these things together as much as you can, and clamping these together would have the same effect, would have the opposite but same effect as freeing up the back springs. There's a lot of issues here. The suspension is simply not designed for acceleration. So to sum it up, Chrysler built an excellent world-class truck rear suspension. You've never heard anybody complain about Dodge trucks not being able to carry the load and do the job, right? But for hot rodding purposes, it's the exact opposite. It has the exact opposite quality in pretty much every way that you would want to make this thing go. Where you can get away with tuning, just doing shocks and tire pressure and pinion snubber height and all of that with a car suspension. With the truck, you're adding parts. Caltrax is the state of the art these days. There are also some very simple traction bars out there that pretty much will do the same thing. There's one made by Tough Country, I believe it is. That's just a simple bracket that mounts above the axle and has a single link going forward that mounts to the chassis. And that link, as the axle tries to twist, that link is pulled on and it keeps it from twisting. Doesn't add any down force to it, but if hop is your problem and not a lack of traction, that'll do the job. You can also, with this car here, I'm probably, just because we're going for that right look, the right head, this one will probably get a set of ladder bars. So there's a lot to think about. If you're messing with a Dodge truck, you're at a severe handicap as far as, as good as the cars are to work with for this type of thing, is as bad as the trucks are. So, but as long as you know what you're up against and what the forces are and why they're applied the way they are, knowledge is power, So as long as you know what you're up against, you'll know the easiest way to fix it. So that's it. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.